Portland was wrapped in one of its endless gray rains, the kind that blurred the city's edges until everything looked half awake. In a narrow apartment near East Burnside, the light that filtered through the blinds was pale and cold. Julia Dawson stood at the kitchen counter, sleeves rolled up, rinsing dishes one by one. The water was lukewarm, the same temperature as the silence in the room. She moved slowly, favoring her left leg, the one that never quite followed the rhythm of the other. She was 32, but her reflection in the dark window looked older, worn by years of trying to stay invisible. The sink dripped. Somewhere in the living room, a muted TV played an old rerun. The smell of beer and fried food lingered in the air, even though she had opened the window an hour ago. Her mother-in-law, Agnes, sat at the table with a crossword and a cup of tea she never finished. "You should be grateful Michael puts up with all this," she said casually, not looking up. "Most men wouldn't be so patient." Julia didn't answer. She had learned that silence hurt less than words. Agnes sighed dramatically. "When I was your age, I ran a household, raised 2 children, and still had time to bake bread every morning. You, dear, can barely stand for long. It's a pity." Julia dried her hands on a towel, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the sink. "Dinner's ready," she said quietly. "I already ate," Agnes replied. "Michael brought takeout yesterday. You didn't need to cook again." Julia didn't mention that the takeout had been cold leftovers. She set a plate anyway. When the door opened, Michael came in, shaking rain off his jacket. His boots left wet prints on the linoleum. "Smells like cabbage again," he muttered, dropping a plastic bag of beer cans onto the counter. "Jesus, Julia, can't you cook something normal for once?" "It's stew," she said softly. "Right." He popped open a can and took a long sip. "You know, my coworkers' wives make lasagna or roast. Real food. But sure, stew's fine. Comfort food for cripples." Agnes chuckled under her breath. "Michael, don't be cruel." But the tone carried no rebuke, only amusement. Julia's hands clenched under the table, nails pressing into her palms. She stared at the steam rising from the pot, wishing it could fog out the sound of their voices. Michael continued, as if her silence irritated him. "You sit at home all day. What do you even do? That so-called design hobby? No one's going to pay you for sketching furniture we can't afford." She swallowed, voice trembling but controlled. "I try to keep busy." He leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, maybe you should keep busy cleaning instead. The bathroom looks like hell." Agnes tooted softly. "Now, Michael, don't talk like that." She tries her best. It's not her fault her leg keeps her from being efficient. The word efficient landed like a knife. Julia nodded once and stood up to clear the plates that hadn't even been touched. She moved carefully, every step measured, familiar, practiced. Outside, rain drummed against the glass. The sound filled the silence between their voices. After a while, Agnes retreated to her bedroom. Michael stayed in front of the TV, watching a game with the volume too high. Julia gathered the last dish and carried it to the sink. Her reflection in the window was pale and tired. She caught her own eyes and looked away. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. 10:22. She used to like that sound once. Now it only marked the hours she'd survived another day. When she finished cleaning, she turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway for a moment. Michael hadn't moved. The glow from the television flickered across his face, a man who'd long stopped trying and made it everyone else's fault. He spoke without looking at her. "You know what my mom said today? She said I could have done better. And she's right. A normal man deserves a normal woman." For a moment, Julia thought she hadn't heard him correctly. But he kept watching the screen, eyes flat, voice calm, as if the sentence meant nothing. She didn't respond. She just stood there, letting the words settle like cold ashes inside her. The rain outside grew heavier, sliding down the window like tears she wouldn't shed. Her limp was barely noticeable when she walked away. She reached the small bedroom, closed the door behind her, and leaned against it, breathing slowly. The apartment hummed with the same dull noises. The TV, the rain, the clock, but something in her chest shifted, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't anger yet. Not courage either. Just the first, fragile crack in the wall of silence she had built around herself. And somewhere, beneath the weight of years of humiliation, a quiet thought began to form, that even broken things could still move, could still find their way toward the light. The living room smelled of beer and takeout. Laughter echoed off the low ceiling, too loud for the small space. Michael sat in the center of it all, legs stretched out, surrounded by 2 coworkers and a neighbor from downstairs. Their voices carried the easy confidence of men who believed the world owed them comfort. Julia had set the table, refilled the snack bowls, and retreated to the corner of the couch. She tried to make herself invisible. Her limp made moving around the room awkward, so she stayed still, smiling when someone looked her way. Michael waved a half-empty can in the air. "You know what it's like living with a designer who doesn't design," he said, laughing. "It's like having a roommate who collects unpaid bills." The men laughed politely. He wasn't finished. "Nah, seriously, she's my little crippled roommate. Can't even chase me out when I'm late." For a split second, no one reacted. Then one of them snorted, and the others followed. The laughter rolled through the room like static. Julia felt every sound strike her skin. She smiled, an instinct, not a choice, and nodded as if the joke were harmless. But her stomach clenched. She stood up quietly, smoothing her skirt. "Excuse me," she murmured and walked to the kitchen. She stayed there, listening to the laughter fade behind her. The faucet dripped. Her hands trembled as she reached for a towel, pretending to dry dishes that were already clean. Her throat burned, but no tears came. When the last guest left and the door closed, the silence felt heavier than the noise had. Michael tossed the empty cans into a plastic bag, humming off-key. She turned to him, voice barely above a whisper. "Don't talk about me like that." He froze. "What did you just say?" Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Please don't talk about me like that. Not in front of people." The air shifted. His face twisted, not with guilt, but disbelief that she had spoken. Then came the smirk, the one she hated most. "You're sensitive all of a sudden?" It was a joke, Julia. Try not to ruin a good night. It wasn't funny. The smirk vanished. The can in his hand hit the counter with a sharp metallic crack. "Don't start," he warned. "You think I need your lectures after working all week? You sit here all day doing nothing, and now you want to tell me how to talk." "I said it hurt me." He slammed the can down again, harder this time. Beer splashed onto the floor. "Ungrateful," he snapped. "I put a roof over your head. I pay the bills. You'd be nothing without me." She flinched, not from fear of being hit, but from the emptiness in his tone. There was no anger there, just contempt. He turned away, muttering to himself, the word ungrateful repeating like an echo. She stood still for a long moment, watching his back, the broad shoulders that once made her feel safe. Now they looked like a wall, cold, impenetrable, and final. When he finally left for the bedroom, the apartment went silent again. Julia crouched to wipe the spilled beer, but her knees gave out halfway down. She sat on the cold linoleum, back against the counter, breathing through the tightness in her chest. The tears came quietly. They weren't the kind that begged for comfort. They came from the simple realization that there was nothing left to fix. The worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was knowing that he didn't see her anymore, not as a partner, not even as a person. She stayed there for what felt like hours. The ticking clock, the only sound in the apartment. 11:23. Each tick felt heavier than the last, as if counting down to something inevitable. She wiped her face, stood up, and turned off the light. The reflection in the window caught her, the outline of a woman sitting in a room that no longer felt like hers. When she lay down that night, The clock in the living room was still ticking, steady and merciless. Every sound marked a choice she hadn't yet made. Tick, another breath. Tick, another hour. Tick, another piece of her breaking free. And as the rain whispered against the glass, Julia stared into the dark and knew, even if she couldn't say it yet, she would not stay here forever. The next morning, the rain had thinned into a silver mist. Portland looked washed clean for once, as if the city itself had taken a deep breath. Julia sat at the small kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug when her laptop chimed. Her inbox was usually filled with newsletters she never read or bills she couldn't bear to open. But this time the subject line froze her in place. Invitation for interview, Harmony Design Studio. She blinked, thinking it must be a mistake. Harmony Design Studio was one of the firms she used to admire from afar, the kind that turned ordinary apartments into art. Her hands shook slightly as she clicked the message open. Dear Ms. Dawson, we came across your design portfolio online and were impressed by your spatial concept sketches. We would like to invite you for an interview this Thursday at 10 a.m. Best regards, Anna Roberts, Creative Director, Harmony Design Studio. For a long moment, Julia just stared at the screen. That portfolio! She'd uploaded it almost 4 years ago, back when she still believed she might have a future in design. Since then, it had gathered digital dust, unseen and forgotten. Until now. Her first instinct was disbelief, then fear. She closed the laptop slowly, her pulse quickening. It's probably a scam, she thought. Or a mistake. Maybe they meant someone else. But then the sunlight, rare, golden, and tentative, cut through the thin curtains, landing on the edge of the table. It felt almost like a sign. Julia exhaled, long and shaky. She opened the laptop again. The email was still there, the words unchanged. For the first time in years, a spark of possibility flickered inside her. She walked to her tiny closet and pulled open the door. Rows of faded clothes greeted her, practical, colorless, chosen more for comfort than hope. In the back hung a navy blue dress she hadn't worn in years. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. She held it up against herself in the mirror. It still fit mostly. She adjusted the hem so it would cover her left leg, the one that made her limp visible. Her eyes lingered there. No matter how long it had been, she could never quite shake the shame that came with it. When Agnes came into the kitchen, Julia was ironing the dress. "What's this?" Agnes asked, her voice thick with suspicion. "I have an interview," Julia said quietly. A design studio reached out. Agnes chuckled. "A design studio? You? Oh, Julia, they probably just need a sympathy case. Someone to tick a charity box." Julia's hand tightened on the iron handle. "Maybe," she said, keeping her voice even. Moments later, Michael emerged from the bedroom, buttoning his shirt. "What's going on?" "Your wife's going to play career woman," Agnes said. "Can you imagine? At her age, with that leg." Michael smirked. "Harmony, huh? Don't embarrass yourself, Julia. These places want people who can handle clients, not someone who can't even walk straight for 10 minutes. Julia didn't answer. She folded the dress carefully and carried it to the bedroom. Behind her, she could still hear their laughter. It sounded small, brittle, like the kind of noise people make when they can't imagine the world changing. She sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the fabric over her knees. The fear was still there, heavy and familiar, but beneath it was something else, defiance. The old Julia would have backed down, made excuses, waited for another time that never came. But now she couldn't stop thinking about that email, about someone out there, a stranger, who had seen her work and believed it was worth something. She glanced at the clock. If she left now, she could take the bus downtown and still have time to find the building. Maybe even sit outside a few minutes to calm her nerves. In the mirror, her reflection looked almost like someone else, cautious but awake. She adjusted the collar of the dress and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The apartment was quiet again. The TV was off. The only sound was the steady drip of rain outside. Julia stood up, took a deep breath, and whispered to her reflection, just one step at a time. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight she hadn't felt in years, not a plea, but a promise. She grabbed her coat, slipped on her worn shoes, and walked toward the door. For a second, her hand hesitated on the knob. Then she straightened her back, exhaled slowly, and opened it. The hallway smelled of damp concrete and old paint. The air was cold against her face. As the door closed behind her, the apartment seemed to shrink into silence. Outside, the rain had stopped, and somewhere between the gray clouds, the first fragile hint of sunlight broke through. Julia stepped into it. The building that housed Harmony Design Studio stood on a quiet street lined with maple trees, their wet leaves glistening under the Portland drizzle. Through the glass doors, Julia could see a warm, golden light spilling from inside. Not the harsh white glare of an office, but something softer, almost alive. She hesitated before stepping in, her pulse steady but quick. The reception area smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Clean lines, muted tones, a vase of wildflowers on the counter. Every detail whispered of care, not extravagance. "Good morning," said the receptionist with a friendly smile. "You must be Ms. Dawson. Ms. Roberts is expecting you." Julia nodded, adjusting the strap of her worn handbag. "Thank you." As she followed the receptionist down the hallway, her heels clicked lightly against the polished concrete floor. Framed photographs of completed projects hung on the walls. Minimalist kitchens, sunlit nursing homes, spaces that looked both elegant and kind. Inside a glass-walled office, a woman stood waiting by a long oak table. She was in her mid-40s, her presence calm but commanding. This was Anna Roberts. Her gray blazer and loose scarf gave her a quiet confidence that felt magnetic. "Julia Dawson," Anna said warmly, extending her hand. "It's good to finally meet you. I've looked through your sketches. They're different, in the best way." Julia shook her hand carefully. "Thank you. I wasn't sure anyone still saw them." Anna smiled. "We don't forget talent. Please sit." The conversation began easily, questions about her past projects, her inspirations, her approach to interior design. Julia answered as honestly as she could. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as the minutes passed. She spoke about her fascination with how people feel in a space, not just how it looks, how furniture placement could make someone in a wheelchair feel independent, how lighting could ease the anxiety of a small room. Anna leaned forward, intrigued. "You think like a behavioral designer, not just a decorator. That's rare." Julia hesitated. "I haven't worked in years," she said softly, "but I never stopped learning. I read journals, took online classes, tried to keep up." Anna's expression softened into something that felt almost like admiration. "That's what we value the most here, people who don't stop learning." For the first time in a long while, Julia felt the warmth of genuine respect. It startled her more than pity ever had. Anna walked to her desk, picked up a folder, and handed it over. "We're starting a new initiative, accessible design for senior housing. Most firms treat it like a checklist. We want empathy, not just compliance. Would you be willing to take on a small test project?" Julia blinked, her breath catching. "You mean as part of the interview?" Anna smiled. "As part of the team, if it goes well." Julia took the folder in both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'd love to." "Good," Anna said, standing. "We'll be in touch soon." "And Julia," Julia looked up, "don't underestimate what time and hardship can teach you. Sometimes they make better designers than any degree." When Julia stepped out of the building, the rain had returned, light, steady, familiar. The air smelled of wet asphalt and freedom. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the folder pressed against her chest, her reflection shimmering faintly in the puddle by her feet. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt possible. Her phone buzzed. The name on the screen made her stomach twist. Michael. She hesitated, then answered, "Hello." His voice came through, sharp and impatient. "Where the hell are you?" "At an interview." He laughed, that low, dismissive laugh she'd memorized. "Right. Playing office again? You think anyone's going to hire you? Don't bother coming home if you think you're better than us." Julia didn't respond. She could hear the TV blaring behind him, Agnes's voice in the background, the same stale noise she had lived in for years. She hung up slowly, staring at the gray sky above. Cars passed, spraying fine mist into the air. One headlight beam caught her face for a brief second, a flash of brightness cutting through the drizzle. Her coat clung to her shoulders, her hair damp, but her eyes no longer looked afraid. She stood there, the phone still in her hand, the city moving around her, and realized that this very moment, was the first step through the door she'd been too afraid to open. The rain kept falling, but it no longer felt like a weight. It felt like baptism. She slipped the phone into her bag, pulled the collar of her coat higher, and started walking. Each step echoed on the wet pavement, uneven, imperfect but steady. Behind her, the glow of Harmony Design Studio faded into the mist. Ahead, the city stretched, wide and unknown. Julia didn't know what waited for her next. She only knew that she wasn't walking home. The apartment Julia found was small, barely more than a single room with a narrow kitchenette and a window that looked out over a tangle of rooftops. But it was hers. The rent was cheap, the walls were uneven, and the heater rattled when it turned on, yet the silence inside belonged to no one but her. She placed a small vase on the windowsill, filled it with wild daisies she bought for $2 at a corner market, and for the first time in years, the air didn't smell like resentment. She slept on a mattress on the floor that first night, wrapped in an old quilt. The city hummed outside, distant traffic, soft rain against the glass. Julia lay awake, not from fear, but from the strange calm that came with solitude. Freedom didn't feel like a grand victory. It was quieter, smaller, the simple relief of not having to flinch at every sound. The next morning, she arrived early at Harmony Design Studio. The office was bright with natural light, walls painted a soft ivory, the faint scent of cedar polish in the air. Colleagues passed her with friendly nods, some stopping to introduce themselves. No one looked at her limp. No one pitied her. They just talked about projects, deadlines, color palettes, normal things, ordinary things. Anna greeted her at the entrance to the open workspace. "Julia, come, I'll show you where you'll be working." Her desk was by a large window overlooking the street, sunlight spilling across the surface. A stack of material samples sat waiting. Soft fabrics, wooden textures, photos of assisted living interiors. "We've reviewed your proposal sketches," Anna said. "I want you to take the lead on this prototype apartment for our senior accessibility project. Don't overthink it. Just design something that feels kind." Julia blinked, unsure she'd heard right. "You mean I lead?" Anna smiled. "Yes. You understand what comfort means better than anyone else here. Trust that." Julia nodded, her throat tight. "I will." The first few days passed in a blur of work. She threw herself into it, sketching layouts, experimenting with furniture height, testing colors that calmed rather than overwhelmed. She worked late, often forgetting to eat. Every time doubt crept in, she remembered Anna's words, "You understand comfort." By the end of the week, she presented her first draft. The conference room was filled with gentle chatter as her colleagues gathered around. She explained her design, how wide hallways could still feel intimate, how natural light could create a sense of safety for those who feared falling. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. When she finished, Anna leaned back in her chair and studied the sketches for a long moment. Then she looked up and said softly, "You have empathy in your work. That's what makes it beautiful." The words hit Julia like a wave. Empathy, not pity, not tolerance. Empathy, the one thing she had always given freely but never received in return. Around her, the others nodded and smiled. Someone asked about material options, Another suggested collaboration on color schemes, normal conversation, professional respect. She smiled back, answering questions, feeling something expand in her chest, something warm, unfamiliar, and almost frightening. When the meeting ended, she excused herself quietly and walked down the hall to the restroom. She locked the door, turned on the faucet, and leaned over the sink. At first, she only stared at her reflection. The fluorescent light was unflattering, but she didn't care. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands trembling. Then, without warning, tears spilled down her face. They came fast, hot, uncontrollable. But she wasn't crying out of sadness. It wasn't grief this time. It was the shock of feeling seen, of realizing that her work, her effort, her existence had finally been acknowledged without mockery. For years, she had learned to shrink herself to fit inside other people's comfort. And now, standing alone in a small restroom with mascara running down her cheeks, she felt something else entirely: space. She pressed a hand to her heart, breathing through the sobs until they softened into quiet laughter. When she finally stepped back into the hallway, no one noticed anything unusual. The office buzzed with life, printers whirring, phones ringing, voices trading ideas. Julia walked past them, lighter somehow, her steps still uneven but more certain. At her desk, sunlight still streamed through the window, hitting the vase of fresh daisies she had placed there that morning. They glowed in the afternoon light, simple, fragile, alive. Julia smiled. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The rain had finally stopped, and the windows at Harmony Design Studio reflected the soft gold of early evening. Julia was finishing a presentation when the receptionist appeared at her desk, pale and uneasy. "Julia, there's a man here asking for you," she whispered. "He says he's your husband." Julia froze. Her pen slipped from her hand. For a second, she thought she'd misheard. Then she saw him, Michael, standing in the lobby, dripping wet, eyes bloodshot, a half-collapsed version of the man she used to know. He stormed toward her before she could react. "What the hell are you doing here?" he barked. "You've been ignoring my calls." Julia glanced around. The entire office had gone silent. Anna had stepped out of her office, her expression composed but watchful. "This is my workplace, Michael," Julia said quietly. "You can't just come here." "You think you're too good for us now," he sneered. "You're my wife, Julia. You belong with me. Let's go." Her co-workers exchanged uneasy glances. Julia stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere with you." He laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut through the air. "You think you can survive without me? You can't even walk straight half the time." The words were cruel, but they didn't sting the way they used to. They fell flat, powerless. Julia simply said, "Please leave." Anna stepped forward then, her voice firm. "Sir, if you continue this behavior, I'll have to call security." Michael turned toward her, stunned that anyone dared challenge him. "Stay out of this. It's between me and my wife." "No," Anna said calmly. "It's between an employee and her right to work without being harassed." The security guard appeared moments later. Julia didn't remember how Michael left, just the echo of his angry voice fading down the hallway. "You'll regret this." That night, Julia didn't cry. She sat in her small apartment, the quiet pressing close around her, and opened her laptop. Her fingers trembled only once before she began typing. Petition for dissolution of marriage. 2 weeks later, the papers were filed. Michael's reaction was immediate and vicious. He showed up at the courthouse with a lawyer who looked as bitter as he did. "You'll leave with nothing," he hissed at her before the hearing. "The house, the car, everything's mine." Julia looked at him for a long moment, her face calm. "I don't want anything that came from you." He scoffed. "You're pathetic." The hearing itself was quick. The house was indeed under Michael's name. The judge ruled accordingly. Julia received only her personal belongings, clothes, a laptop, and a few tools of her trade. But Anna, who had come to sit quietly in the back of the courtroom, wasn't done fighting for her. When the session ended, Anna walked over and placed a gentle hand on Julia's shoulder. "You did well," she said, "but you shouldn't have to do it alone." Julia frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've already called my attorney," Anna replied. "He'll make sure Michael doesn't use your name or try to damage your credit. You've built something new for yourself. Let's protect it." Julia wanted to protest, but the kindness in Anna's tone left no room for argument. She simply nodded. "Thank you." Outside, the courthouse steps were slick from an earlier shower. The air smelled of wet pavement and clean beginnings. Julia stood there for a moment, the decree folded in her hand, the ink still fresh. Around her, people hurried past, lawyers, couples, strangers, all of them carrying pieces of their own unfinished stories. Julia watched them, then looked down at the paper again. Her name was there, alone now, no longer tied to his. A breeze lifted her hair, cool and steady. She closed her eyes, letting it brush against her face. It wasn't triumph she felt. It wasn't even relief. It was something quieter, the simple rhythm of breathing without permission. In her mind, she heard the echo of Michael's last threat. "You'll leave with nothing." She looked at the paper once more and smiled faintly. Nothing, she thought, has never felt this light. The city's late afternoon light was changing, gray softening into amber, the kind that turned even concrete into something warm. She walked down the courthouse steps, her shoes clicking against the stone, her heart sinking with each sound. Freedom has no furniture, she thought, but it finally has a heartbeat. As she reached the bottom of the steps, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint scent of rain and something new, something alive. Julia lifted her face toward it, her eyes steady, her hand still trembling, but for once, not from fear. For the first time in years, she wasn't leaving somewhere. She was walking toward something. 2 years had passed since the courthouse steps. Time, once heavy and suffocating, now moved with a quiet rhythm, like rain against the window or a heartbeat in sleep. Julia had built a new life, not out of grand gestures or miracles, but from small, deliberate acts of healing. Her apartment in East Portland was no longer a bare room with peeling paint. It was bright now, sunlight spilled through wide windows every morning, catching the soft green leaves of the plants she kept on every ledge. The air always smelled faintly of mint and sawdust from her design samples. A small orange cat named Maple stretched lazily across her drafting table, his tail flicking whenever she reached for her pencil. The space reflected her, imperfect, alive, and quietly proud. Her days were full but calm. She worked at Harmony's newly opened branch, leading a small team that specialized in adaptive interior design, creating homes for people with mobility challenges, sensory sensitivities, or chronic illnesses. The kind of work that required not just creativity, but empathy. Julia had become known in the community for it. Articles had been written. Clients requested her by name. But she never saw herself as successful, only as useful, finally in the right way. One late afternoon, she stood by the large windows of her new office, watching the light fade into the gray-blue of an Oregon dusk. Anna Roberts stepped inside, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You're still here," Anna said, smiling. Julia turned and laughed softly. "Old habits. I like to make sure the world hasn't changed while I wasn't looking." Anna handed her a mug and leaned against the desk. "The board just approved your proposal for the community housing project. It's going statewide. You've done something remarkable, Julia." Julia's eyes widened. "Really?" Anna nodded. "You're leading it. It's your vision. Homes that adapt to people, not the other way around." Julia sat down, trying to process the words. 2 years ago, she hadn't even believed she'd have a job, let alone a career that mattered. "Thank you," she said finally, "for everything." Anna took a sip of her coffee, studying her. "You did the work. I just opened a door." Julia smiled faintly, looking out the window again. "You know," she said after a pause, "I used to think broken meant useless." Anna tilted her head. "And now?" Julia turned toward her, her eyes calm, voice steady. Now I know it just means human. The room fell silent for a moment. Outside, car headlights traced golden lines through the mist. Anna nodded slowly. That's the kind of wisdom that makes great designers, she said. After Anna left, Julia stood there for a while, sipping her coffee, watching the city come alive with evening light. Inside her, everything felt balanced, the kind of peace she'd once thought was impossible. She walked home later that night, the streets glistening after a light drizzle. The cafe on the corner still played old jazz records, the smell of coffee drifting into the cold air. When she reached her apartment, Maple was waiting by the door, meowing softly as if scolding her for being late. She laughed, scooping him up. "I'm home, little one." In the quiet of her apartment, she set down her bag, changed into soft pajamas, and lit a small candle on the windowsill. The flickering flame reflected in the glass, mingling with the distant city lights. It was a life she had built from nothing, one slow step at a time. No shouting, no chaos, no cruelty, just warmth, silence, and space to breathe. And yet, as she sat by the window, petting Maple and listening to the soft hum of the city, Julia felt a faint echo of something missing. Not loneliness exactly, more like an empty corner in her heart, untouched, waiting. Freedom had filled her life with peace, but not yet with meaning beyond herself. She looked down at Maple, who was now asleep on her lap, and whispered, almost to the air, "Maybe someday, it'll be time to open another door." Outside, the city lights flickered like quiet promises, and for the first time, Julia didn't feel afraid of what might come next. The email arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Julia was reviewing floor plans when Anna stopped by her desk, a folder in hand. "We're partnering with an external architect for the new Rehabilitation Center project," she said. "It's a major contract, adaptive living spaces for patients who've lost mobility after accidents. I want you to co-lead the design phase." Julia straightened, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Who's the architect?" Anna smiled knowingly. "Andrew Parker. He's based in Seattle, but will be working here for the next few months. You'll meet him this afternoon." Julia had heard the name before. Andrew Parker was respected in the field for his minimalist, yet humane approach to architecture. Widowed several years ago, he was known for keeping to himself, letting his work speak for him. By 3 o'clock, the meeting room was set. Julia arranged her notes, the hum of quiet anticipation beneath her calm exterior. The door opened and Andrew walked in, tall, with graying hair at the temples, a neatly pressed shirt, and the quiet composure of someone who carried both authority and loss. His presence didn't demand attention, it invited it. Anna introduced them, then left the two to discuss the design brief. As Julia outlined the initial concept, gentle transitions between private and communal spaces, natural lighting to encourage mental recovery. She noticed he was listening with full focus, not interrupting, not rushing. When she paused, he leaned slightly forward. "You speak from experience," he said softly. Julia hesitated, then nodded. "I understand what it feels like when your own body limits you." It wasn't a rehearsed line. It was truth, quiet and unguarded. Andrew met her eyes, and for a moment neither spoke. There was no pity in his expression, only recognition, the kind that comes from someone who has lived through his own kind of confinement. He finally said, "That's what most designs lack, empathy you can feel in the walls." From that moment, the collaboration began not as a task, but as a conversation. They met daily, sketching ideas on the same notepad, debating layouts, testing materials. Julia found herself drawn to his calm precision. He, in turn, seemed to value her sensitivity to detail. He would often pause while she explained a concept, then quietly translate it into architectural structure, a perfect balance of intuition and logic. One evening, as they reviewed accessibility routes through the building, Julia noticed a scar along his wrist when he reached across the table. She didn't ask about it, but later, as they packed up, he said quietly, "My wife was in a car accident. That's how I got into rehabilitation design." I built her a home she never lived to see. Julia's breath caught. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded once. Don't be. That home is what keeps me building. For a moment, the office felt different, softer, fragile. Julia wanted to say something, but words failed her. Instead, she smiled faintly. Then maybe this project will help someone else find their way home. He looked at her then, really looked, and there was something steady and warm in his eyes. I think it already has, he said. Over the following weeks, their partnership grew natural, almost effortless. They finished each other's thoughts in design meetings, challenged each other's assumptions, and laughed at tiny mistakes that once would have embarrassed her. Julia realized she no longer second-guessed herself when she spoke. She didn't shrink back. Working with Andrew felt like breathing again. One Friday evening, after sending the final blueprint revisions to the client, Julia was closing her laptop when her phone buzzed. A message popped up. Andrew Parker, you make spaces feel like home again. She stared at the screen for a long time, the words glowing softly in the dim light of her apartment. Maple curled at her feet, purring, while rain tapped gently on the window. Julia smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She typed a reply, then paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. For once, she didn't feel the need to respond right away. She just sat there, letting the warmth of the moment sink in. Outside, the city lights shimmered through the rain, and for the first time in years, home no longer felt like a place. It felt like possibility. Love, when it returned, did not arrive with thunder. It came softly, like light through curtains on a quiet morning. For months after the project began, Julia and Andrew had fallen into an easy rhythm. They met early to review plans, shared lunches over scattered blueprints, and often stayed late at the office, working in comfortable silence. What surprised her most was how natural it felt. There were no grand gestures, no sudden confessions, just a steady companionship that grew roots without either of them realizing. Sometimes, after long days, they would stop at a small cafe on Burnside Avenue. It became their unspoken ritual. One cup of coffee, one slice of cinnamon loaf. Two lives that had once been broken learning how to exist side by side. Julia liked the way he listened. He never tried to fix her words or fill her silences. When she talked about her design process or her struggles with self-doubt, he simply nodded, thoughtful as if every word mattered. And in return, she learned the quiet art of listening too, to the pauses between his sentences, to the weight of what he didn't say. One evening, the sky outside was washed in pink and violet, the air heavy with the scent of rain. They were sitting across from each other, the cafe nearly empty, when Andrew finally spoke about his wife. She loved the ocean, he said, staring at his untouched cup. After the accident, she couldn't walk anymore. I kept trying to rebuild her world. Ramps, lifts, wider doorways. I thought if I fixed the space, maybe I could fix her pain. But grief doesn't work that way. Julia looked at him, her chest tightening with empathy. It's not something you fix, she said softly. He nodded. I know that now, but I spent years trying to design my way out of grief. Every project since then has been a conversation with her, one she'll never answer. Julia reached across the table, her fingers resting near his, but not quite touching. Her voice was steady. We don't move on, she said. We move forward. He met her eyes then, not with sadness but recognition. For a long moment, they simply sat there, the hum of the espresso machine filling the silence. Outside, the rain began again, tapping gently against the windows. Andrew's hand moved slightly, almost unconsciously, until it brushed hers. It wasn't planned or dramatic, it just happened. The warmth of his palm against her skin felt like a question, and somehow an answer too. Julia didn't pull away. She smiled, small and real. There was no rush, no breathless moment of confession. They didn't speak about what it meant. They didn't need to. Some things, after all, didn't require words. In the weeks that followed, their connection deepened, quietly, carefully. They began to share more of the unspoken corners of their lives. The books that had shaped them, the places they still wanted to see, the memories that still ached when least expected. Sometimes, after work, they walked along the waterfront, where the city lights danced across the Willamette River. Andrew would tell her stories about architecture students who thought beauty could only exist in perfection. Julia would laugh and tell him that imperfection was what made things real, and he'd smile as if she'd reminded him of something he'd forgotten. It wasn't a romance built on fireworks or declarations. It was two quiet lives learning how to hold space for each other. And for Julia, that was everything. One night, after another long day, she came home and stood by her window. The city shimmered below, endless and alive. Maple purred softly at her feet. She thought about how far she had come, from that cramped apartment filled with contempt, from the weight of a marriage that had shrunk her world. She was no longer surviving someone else's cruelty. She was living her own choice. Her phone buzzed a message from Andrew. "Good night, Julia. Thank you for today." She smiled, setting the phone down. Outside, the rain eased into a soft drizzle, and for the first time, she realized she didn't feel broken anymore. She felt human, whole even. And as she turned off the lights and slipped into bed, Julia understood that love didn't have to rescue her. It simply had to walk beside her. It was a quiet Saturday evening in downtown Portland, the kind of evening when the city glowed like a memory. Rain had passed an hour ago, leaving the streets slick and shining under the golden lights. Julia and Andrew sat near the window of a small restaurant known for its warm bread and jazz softly playing in the background. The air inside was alive with quiet conversation and the clinking of glasses. Julia wore a deep green dress, her hair swept loosely over one shoulder. There was something effortlessly elegant about her, not the elegance of luxury but of peace. Andrew, across from her, was telling a story about his new interns, and Julia laughed, her voice light but full. It had been 3 years since the courthouse. 3 years since she had walked away with nothing but a box of belongings and a heartbeat she wasn't sure would survive. But here she was, whole, unhurried, and quietly radiant. Their food arrived, and as Andrew poured her a glass of red wine, the door opened. A gust of cool air swept through, carrying the faint scent of rain. Julia didn't notice at first, but then she heard a familiar voice, low, careless, loud in the way that demanded attention. Michael. He was laughing with 2 old colleagues, his tone full of that same easy arrogance she once mistook for charm. His hair was thinner now, his face heavier, but it was the eyes that stopped her heart for a moment. Still restless, still searching for someone else to blame. He turned. The laughter died mid-sentence. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, time folded back on itself. All the years of silence, the nights she'd cried quietly so no one would hear, the words he had thrown at her like stones. All of it stood between them like glass. But this time Julia didn't flinch. Michael froze, the smirk slipping from his face. He looked at her as if trying to understand who she was. This woman with calm eyes, poised posture, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. He looked at Andrew, too, the way he leaned toward her, the ease between them. Michael's jaw tightened. For a moment he hesitated, his hand twitching as if to wave. Old reflexes, old control. He took a step toward her. Julia felt the motion, sensed it more than saw it. She turned slightly in her chair, her chin lifting just enough. When their eyes met again, she smiled, small, courteous, distant. Then she nodded once, politely, like acknowledging a stranger in passing. And then she turned back to Andrew. "Sorry," she said softly, her voice steady. "You were saying about the new project in Seattle." Andrew smiled, continuing his story as if nothing had happened. But Julia could feel his hand brush lightly against hers under the table. Not possessive, just grounding. Michael stopped mid-step, uncertain. Around him, his friends had gone quiet, sensing the shift. One of them murmured something, but he didn't hear. His gaze lingered on Julia, on the laughter that returned to her face, the warmth in her eyes as she listened to another man speak. For the first time, he saw her not as someone beneath him, but as someone far beyond his reach. The waiter passed between them, breaking the line of sight. When Michael looked again, Julia was laughing, a soft, easy laugh that reached her eyes. It was the sound of someone who no longer remembered how it felt to beg for love. He turned away then, awkwardly. One of his friends said something about ordering drinks, and he nodded without listening. His reflection in the restaurant's glass looked back at him, older, tired, empty. Outside, the rain began again, a slow drizzle that caught the streetlights in silver threads. Through the window, he could still see her. Julia's hand rested near Andrew's, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. The light above their table glowed warm and golden, wrapping them in something that looked like peace. Michael stood there a moment longer, the sound of jazz drifting faintly through the door each time it opened. Then he stepped back onto the wet sidewalk, his shoes splashing through shallow puddles. No one turned to watch him leave. Inside, Julia lifted her glass, smiling as Andrew said something that made her laugh again. For her, the moment had already passed. She didn't think about the man at the door, the years she had lost, or the pain that had once defined her. Those things belonged to another lifetime, one she had already outgrown. The band shifted to a softer tune, a slow piano melody that wrapped itself around the hum of quiet voices. Julia looked out the window for a moment. The rain blurred the city lights into something beautiful and soft, like an old painting. She took a breath, feeling the steady rhythm of her own pulse, calm, strong, certain. Across the table, Andrew was watching her. "You okay?" he asked gently. Julia nodded. "Better than okay." She reached for his hand and he met her halfway. No fireworks, no drama, just warmth. Outside, the rain deepened, cascading against the window in silvery streaks. The reflection in the glass showed two faces side by side, surrounded by light. And somewhere beyond the glass, a man stood motionless, staring in, the water distorting his features until even he couldn't recognize what he'd become. Julia didn't see him anymore. She didn't need to. Her laughter rose softly above the music, not the laughter of victory, but of freedom. Because revenge, she realized, didn't always need noise or fire. Sometimes it was as quiet as living well, as gentle as peace, and as radiant as knowing you had survived everything meant to break you. Outside, the city shimmered under the rain, and inside, Julia Dawson finally smiled like someone who had come home.
The world keeps turning, and with each turn comes a new story. When one door closes, another opens, leading us into a journey entirely different. Let us set aside the echoes of the tale just past and step together into a new realm where another destiny awaits to be told. And now I invite you to listen to the second story, a path of its own, unrelated to what came before, yet filled with mysteries and surprises meant only for those willing to journey onward with me.
The snow had not stopped falling since dawn. Outside the narrow apartment building in South Minneapolis, flakes drifted down in slow, relentless waves, covering sidewalks and parked cars in a heavy white sheet. Inside one of the cramped units on the third floor, Grace Miller pulled her son's jacket tighter and tried to ignore the chill creeping in through the drafty windows. Ethan, barely 3 years old, sat on the floor with a toy truck making soft engine noises, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around him. The knock on the door was sharp, deliberate, and repeated. Grace knew that sound. She rose quickly, smoothing the front of her worn sweater, and opened it to face her landlord. Mrs. Phyllis Johnson filled the doorway like a wall, an older woman with stiff shoulders, thin lips, and an expression that had grown colder by the day. "You need to pack your things," Phyllis said without preamble. "I told you this week was the end. My nephew's moving in tomorrow, and I'm not waiting another day." Grace's stomach dropped. She had begged for an extension only days ago, hoping that Phyllis would relent. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been keeping up with the utilities. I fixed the leaking sink myself, and I repainted the bedroom when no one else would. Just until the 5th. My friend will help me with rent then. We'll be gone after that, I swear." Phyllis folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. Utilities? Paint? You think that buys you the right to stay here for free? You've been squatting on charity long enough. My nephew needs a place. He's young, hardworking, and he pays on time. Unlike you. Grace's throat tightened. I'm not asking for charity. I can't take Ethan out in this weather. Look at him. She gestured toward her son, who had toddled over, clutching his toy truck against his chest. His cheeks were already flushed from the cold air inside. But Phyllis's expression didn't soften. Whose fault is that? You should have thought about consequences before dragging a child into your mess. You've had months to figure this out. Today is the last day. If you're not gone by sundown, I'll call the police and tell them you're trespassing. The words landed like blows. Grace stepped back, clutching the edge of the door for support. Trespassing? I've been paying the bills, doing repairs. Phyllis cut her off with a sharp laugh. Repairs? Bills? That's not rent, sweetheart. You're nothing but a freeloader. And when the cops get here, I'll make sure they see it that way. You want to risk getting hauled off in handcuffs while your boy goes to social services. Grace's breath caught. The image seared into her mind. Ethan crying, alone, taken from her arms. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak calmly, even as panic pressed against her ribs. You don't mean that. Please, Mrs. Johnson, at least let us stay until morning. I'll have somewhere to go by then. I promise. But Phyllis was unmoved. You've promised before. I'm done waiting. You've got 1 hour. After that, I'm calling 911. The door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the tiny apartment. Grace stood frozen, her hand still on the knob, as Ethan tugged at her sleeve. Mommy, he asked softly, his eyes wide. Her knees threatened to give way, but she steadied herself. She couldn't collapse, not now. It's okay, baby, she whispered, bending down to kiss his hair. We're just going to take a little trip. She looked around the apartment, a place she had tried to make a home. The walls bore fresh paint she had bought on discount. The shelves, once empty, now held small touches she had found at thrift stores. A chipped ceramic lamp, a framed picture of a field in summer. Every improvement had been hers. Every effort to carve out a safe corner for Ethan. And now it was all being stripped away with a few cruel words. She grabbed the old duffel bag from under the bed and began stuffing it with what little they could carry. 2 changes of clothes for Ethan, his blanket, her winter coat, the documents she couldn't afford to lose. The toy truck went in last, though Ethan clutched it fiercely before finally surrendering it to the bag. Her fingers shook as she zipped it closed. She wanted to scream, to cry, to throw herself at the locked door of Mrs. Johnson's unit downstairs and beg. But she knew it would be useless. The landlord had made up her mind. Grace had seen the gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. Ethan whined as she bundled him into his heavy jacket, the sleeves still a little too long. His mittens dangled from their string, and she tugged them over his small hands, trying to smile though her eyes burned with tears. There, all warm. You'll see, sweetheart. We'll be fine. When she opened the door, a blast of icy air rushed in, cutting straight through her layers of clothing. Snow swirled in the corridor, blown in through the cracked stairwell window. Grace tightened her scarf, hoisted the duffel onto one shoulder, and lifted Ethan with her free arm. He buried his face against her neck, muffling a small sob. Step by step, they descended the narrow staircase. The smell of old paint and dust clung to the walls, mixed with the faint scent of someone cooking down the hall. None of the neighbors opened their doors. No one offered to help. Grace felt their silence pressing in like another wall of ice. At the front entrance, she paused. Beyond the glass, snow covered the street in blinding white. Cars moved slowly, their headlights hazy in the flurries. Her breath fogged the window as she pressed her forehead against it, just for a moment, letting despair wash over her. Then she straightened. She couldn't stop. Ethan needed her. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at her coat, stinging her face, but she held her son tighter and forced her boots through the snow. Behind her, the apartment building loomed dark and unwelcoming, its windows glowing faintly against the gray sky. Ahead stretched the endless streets of Minneapolis, blanketed in white, each flake a reminder of how alone they were. Grace took a deep breath and started walking, each step carrying her further from the only shelter she had known, into a night that promised nothing but cold and uncertainty. The snowstorm had thickened, swallowing the streetlights until they glowed like faint orbs floating in the blur of white. Grace pulled Ethan closer to her chest, the duffel bag dragging heavily against her shoulder. Each step sank into drifts that reached nearly to her knees. The cold air burned in her lungs, turning every breath into pain. But she kept moving because stopping meant danger. Ethan whimpered softly, his mittened hands clutching the collar of her coat. "Mommy, it's cold," he mumbled, his voice muffled against her scarf. "I know, sweetheart. Just hold on. We'll find somewhere warm," she whispered, though she had no idea where that would be. Her eyes scanned the street, but the shops were shuttered, and the few cars that passed were coated with snow, drivers intent only on getting home. No one slowed. No one noticed her. She tried to shield Ethan from the wind with her own body, turning so her back bore the brunt of the icy gusts. The boy's little face pressed against her neck, his breath hot and uneven, and Grace felt her heart twist. A mother should never have to carry her child through a storm like this. Her numb fingers fumbled in her coat pocket until they found her phone. The screen flickered weakly, the battery drained from the cold, but it still came to life. She scrolled through the contacts, her thumb trembling, until she landed on Hannah Lewis. Hannah was the only friend she had left in the city, a co-worker from a grocery store job she had held briefly. They weren't close enough to lean on each other for every crisis, but Grace had no choice. She pressed the call button. "Hannah, please pick up," she whispered into the night, her lips shaking. The ring tone cut through the howling wind. Once, twice. Finally, Hannah's voice came through, strained but clear. "Grace? Where are you? It's late." Grace's chest tightened with relief. "Hannah, I'm so sorry to call you like this. I need help. My landlord kicked us out. Ethan and I are on the street, and I don't have anywhere to go." A pause. Then Hannah's voice lowered. "Oh God, Grace, I told you I'd send the money, but my paycheck doesn't come until tomorrow. Can you make it until then? Stay with a friend, maybe a shelter?" Grace bit down hard on her lip. Her teeth tasted of iron. "There's no one else. Shelters are full. I already tried last week. Please, Hannah. Anything. Just tonight." Another pause. Hannah sounded guilty, almost whispering. "I'll wire the money first thing in the morning, I swear. Please, Grace, hold on until then. Just keep Ethan warm." The line went silent after a few words of reassurance, and the call ended. Grace stared at the screen, the frost creeping along its edges. Her friend meant well, but words couldn't fight off the snow pressing down on them now. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, her hand shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. But fate was crueler than even that. The duffel slipped from her shoulder, and as she bent down to adjust it, the phone tumbled from her grasp. It hit the ice-slick street with a crack. For a heartbeat, she thought it might be fine. But then headlights flared in the storm. A car rolled past, slow but unstoppable, and the tire crushed the small device with a sickening crunch. "No." Grace gasped, stumbling forward. She grabbed the shattered remains, the screen already black, glass spider-webbed with cracks. She pressed the buttons desperately, willing it back to life. Nothing. Her breath came out in ragged bursts, fogging in the air as panic swelled inside her. That phone had been her only lifeline, the only way to reach Hannah, to call for help, to know she wasn't alone in this frozen city. Without it, she was cut off, drifting in a world of snow and silence. Ethan stirred in her arms, sensing her fear. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice small. She forced herself to smile, though tears blurred her vision. "It's okay, baby. Just a little accident. We'll be fine." But the words rang hollow, brittle as the ice beneath her boots. She pressed him closer, burying her face in his hat, inhaling the warm, familiar scent of her child. The tears she had held back spilled freely now, mingling with the snowflakes on her cheeks. Her shoulders shook as sobs tore through her chest. Ethan lifted his head, his eyes wide and confused. "Don't cry, Mommy." He reached out with a mitten, clumsily brushing at her wet face. The gesture broke her heart. She should be comforting him, not the other way around. She should be the strong one, the protector. Instead, here she was, standing in the middle of a storm with nothing left. Not shelter, not money, not even a phone. Just her son's small hand against her cheek, reminding her what little she still had to fight for. Grace stumbled toward the nearest bench half buried in snow and lowered herself onto it, holding Ethan tightly in her lap. The storm swirled around them, and for a moment she let herself weep openly, her body shaking as she rocked him back and forth. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his hair. "I'm so sorry I can't give you more. I've failed you, Ethan." The boy didn't understand. He only snuggled closer, his breath warm against her neck. His trust was absolute, unshaken, and that made the weight of her guilt heavier than ever. The world blurred into white. The storm muffled the city until there was nothing but the howl of wind and the steady thump of her heart. Grace wiped her face with the back of her glove, forcing herself to stand again. She couldn't stay there. If she froze, Ethan froze with her. With every ounce of strength left, she hitched the duffel higher on her shoulder, tightened her grip on her son, and stepped back into the snow. Her tears had dried to salt on her skin, but inside she still carried the gnawing certainty that she was failing. Yet she walked on, because even failures had to keep going when their children depended on them. The wind lashed at Grace's face as she bent down, trying to scoop up the broken pieces of her phone from the icy street. Snow swirled around her like a curtain, stinging her eyes and blurring her vision. She barely noticed the glow of headlights approaching through the storm until the car's horn blared. For one breathless moment she froze, clutching Ethan against her chest, paralyzed by the blinding lights bearing down on them. Then an arm, firm, strong, seized her shoulder and yanked her backward. The car roared past, the driver shouting something lost to the wind, and the blast of air left Grace trembling. She stumbled, nearly slipping, but the man steadied her with surprising ease. "Are you out of your mind?" His voice was sharp but not unkind, colored by urgency. When Grace looked up, blinking snow from her lashes, she saw a tall man with dark hair dusted white, his tailored coat clinging with frost. His eyes, steel gray, scanned her quickly before settling on the boy in her arms. Grace's voice caught. I dropped my phone. I wasn't watching." He frowned, then softened as he took in the sight of Ethan clinging to her neck, his face flushed from the cold. "You can't be out here with a child in this weather. You'll both freeze." Grace wanted to protest, to insist she was fine, but her lips quivered too much to form the words. Instead, she clutched Ethan tighter, her pride battling with desperation. The man glanced up the street, then back at her. "There's a cafe open just around the corner. Come on. You both need warmth." Grace hesitated. The warning in her mind screamed not to trust strangers, not when she was this vulnerable. But the child in her arms whimpered softly, and she felt the sharp sting of guilt. Whatever pride she had left couldn't outweigh his safety. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. "All right." He offered his arm, not a gesture of dominance, but of support, and guided her down the block. Snow whipped around them, piling at their ankles, but within minutes the glowing sign of a corner cafe came into view. Light spilled through frosted windows, golden and soft against the storm. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open, ushering her inside. Warmth rushed over them like a blanket. The air smelled of roasted coffee and cinnamon. Grace blinked against the sudden contrast, her frozen cheeks burning as they thawed. The cafe was nearly empty, only a couple in the far corner, their heads bent together, and an older man at the counter reading a newspaper. Strings of Christmas lights twinkled along the windows, and a small tree in the corner glittered with ornaments. The stranger led her to a booth near the heater. "Sit," he said firmly. Grace lowered Ethan onto the cushioned seat. The boy immediately pressed his hands against the warm surface, sighing with relief. She sat beside him, still clutching the duffel bag like a lifeline. The man shrugged off his snow-covered coat and approached the counter. Grace watched warily as he exchanged a few words with the barista. Within minutes, he returned with 2 steaming mugs and a small cup of cocoa topped with whipped cream. He set the cocoa in front of Ethan with a careful smile. For him. Ethan's eyes widened. He looked to his mother for permission. Grace hesitated, then nodded. The boy wrapped both hands around the warm cup, giggling softly as the whipped cream touched his lip. The man slid one of the mugs toward Grace. "You need this more than I do." She stared at the coffee, then at him. Her fingers trembled as she wrapped them around the mug. The heat seeped into her skin, thawing the ache. She inhaled the rich scent, but her suspicion lingered. "Why are you doing this?" He met her gaze steadily, because no one should be left outside in a storm, especially not with a child. His tone was even, not pitying, just matter of fact. Still, Grace lowered her eyes, embarrassed. "We don't have money. I can't pay you back." He leaned back slightly, folding his hands on the table. "I didn't ask for payment. Call it decency, if that still means anything these days." The word stung, not because they were harsh, but because they reminded her how rare such decency felt. Grace swallowed hard, unsure what to say. She sipped from the cup, the heat flooding down her throat, and for the first time that day, she felt something close to comfort. The man watched her for a moment before offering a hand across the table. "Alexander Harrington, but most people call me Alex." She hesitated before shaking it, her grip tentative. Grace Miller, and this is Ethan." Alex nodded toward the boy, who was happily smearing whipped cream on his mitten. "He looks like a strong kid." Grace smiled, faintly despite herself. "He doesn't complain much, even when things are hard." Their eyes met, and for a moment the cafe fell away. The storm, the cold, the despair outside, all forgotten. The glow of the Christmas lights reflected in the window, casting a soft shimmer over the table. Ethan's giggle echoed faintly as he tapped his spoon against the mug. It was a fragile moment of peace, one Grace hadn't felt in months. Still, she couldn't shake the gnawing caution. "Thank you for helping us, but we'll only stay long enough for him to finish. I don't want to be a burden." Alex's lips curved into a faint smile. "Some burdens are lighter than you think." He didn't press further, only sat back and let the warmth of the cafe do its work. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, but within those walls, surrounded by twinkling lights and the sweet scent of cocoa, Grace and Ethan were safe, at least for a little while. The cafe closed just after midnight. Grace dreaded stepping back into the storm, but Alex insisted on calling a cab and riding with them. The city was still buried in snow, the streets nearly deserted, headlights casting eerie cones of light through the flurries. Grace sat stiffly in the back seat with Ethan asleep against her shoulder, the duffel bag wedged between her knees. When the cab stopped in front of a modest downtown hotel, she panicked. "I can't afford." Alex raised a hand, cutting her off. "Don't argue. You and your son need a warm bed tonight, not another hour in the cold." The words left no room for debate. Grace swallowed her pride and followed him into the lobby. The clerk recognized Alex immediately, his tone deferential. A credit card appeared in Alex's hand, the transaction swift, unquestioned. Within minutes, Grace was standing in a small but clean room with 2 double beds, the heater humming, the smell of fresh linens filling the air. Ethan stirred as she laid him down, curling instinctively beneath the blanket. Grace tucked him in, smoothing his hair, then turned to Alex, who lingered near the door. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, her voice thick with conflicted gratitude. His gaze was steady. "Yes, I did. Sleep. We'll talk in the morning." And then he was gone, leaving her in a silence broken only by Ethan's gentle breathing. Morning light filtered through thin curtains, pale and cold. Grace stirred to the sound of Ethan humming to himself, playing with his toy truck on the bedspread. For the first time in weeks, she felt warmth that wasn't stolen or temporary. She allowed herself one deep breath before reality pressed in again. A knock startled her. She opened the door cautiously to find Alex, freshly shaven, his coat dusted with snow. In his hand was a small box. "You left this behind," he said casually, stepping inside. He opened the box and placed it on the dresser. Inside lay a brand new smartphone. Grace's breath caught. "Alex, I can't accept this. You don't have a choice. You need a phone. For emergencies, for your son. Take it." Her hands hovered over the box, trembling. "I don't know how to repay you." He studied her for a moment. "Maybe you can." Something in his tone unsettled her. "What do you mean?" Alex sat on the edge of the opposite bed, his expression unreadable. "My grandfather is ill. He's been asking to meet the woman I plan to marry. Until a week ago, I thought I had one to introduce. But," he exhaled sharply, frustration flickering in his eyes, "she betrayed me, walked away when I needed her most." Grace froze. The idea of Alex, with his polished suit and commanding presence, needing anything from her was absurd. "I'm sorry," she murmured. He nodded once, dismissing his own pain. Then his eyes locked onto hers. "That's where you come in. I want you to pretend to be my fiancé, just long enough to put my grandfather at ease." For a moment, silence pressed in, broken only by the rattle of the heater. Grace's stomach twisted. "That's ridiculous. You don't even know me." "I know enough," Alex replied evenly. "I know you're a mother who would do anything for her child. I know you're stronger than you realize. And I know you need somewhere safe to stay. This arrangement gives us both what we want." Her heart pounded. The proposal, if it could even be called that, was madness. To lie to an entire family? To step into a world that wasn't hers? Every instinct told her to refuse. Yet Ethan's soft giggle pulled her back. He sat cross-legged on the bed, pushing his truck along the blanket, warm and safe for the first time in days. Safe because of Alex. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, torn between fear and necessity. "And if your family finds out the truth?" "They won't," Alex said with quiet certainty. "I'll handle everything. All you have to do is stand beside me. Smile when expected. Let them believe. Afterward, you can walk away, no strings attached." Her breath trembled as she weighed his words. She thought of Mrs. Johnson's threats, of the icy streets, of Hannah's empty promises. She thought of Ethan's flushed cheeks in the storm. Alex leaned forward slightly, his voice lower. "It's a small price for shelter, for protection, for a chance to start breathing again." Grace shut her eyes. It was dangerous, reckless, but she couldn't deny the pull of survival, the need to secure something, anything for her son. She opened her eyes again, meeting Alex's gaze. "All right, I'll do it. For a few days." Something like relief flickered across his face, though he quickly masked it. "Good. Then we have an understanding." Grace's shoulders sagged. She felt both trapped and saved, caught in a bargain she didn't fully understand but couldn't refuse. As Ethan reached for her hand, she squeezed it tightly, whispering a silent promise. "This is for you. Always for you." Outside, the snow had stopped. The streets glistened beneath the pale winter sun, a deceptive calm before the storm yet to come. The drive out of the city stretched long and silent, Snow-covered fields blurred past the windows, and Grace sat rigid in the back seat. Ethan curled against her side. Alex drove with quiet assurance, his profile steady in the dim glow of the dashboard. Grace's mind raced with doubts, but every time she glanced at her son, she reminded herself why she had agreed to this impossible arrangement. A few days of pretending, shelter, safety. By late afternoon, the car turned onto a private road flanked by tall pines, their branches bowed with snow. At the end of the drive, a mansion emerged from the white landscape. Its stone facade stood grand and imposing, windows glowing with warm light against the cold gray sky. Grace drew in a sharp breath. The Harrington estate was nothing like the cramped apartments she had known. Ethan pressed his nose against the glass. "Big house, Mommy," he whispered, awestruck. Grace forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. Very big." Alex pulled up to the front entrance, where lanterns glowed on either side of heavy oak doors. A man in a uniform stepped forward to take his coat and bags, but Alex shook his head, opening the door for Grace instead. "Welcome," he said, his voice calm though his eyes revealed a flicker of something. Nervousness, perhaps. Grace hesitated before stepping out, clutching Ethan's hand. The cold air bit her cheeks, but the grandeur of the house distracted her. She had the uneasy sense of walking onto a stage, every movement about to be judged. The doors opened and warmth spilled out. A woman swept forward, tall, elegant, her blonde hair perfectly arranged. Eleanor Harrington. She moved with practiced grace, her smile radiant as she pulled Alex into a quick embrace. "You're finally here!" she exclaimed, then turned to Grace. "And this must be—" Eleanor's voice softened. "Grace, yes? Alex has told us so much about you." Grace froze, caught between disbelief and the weight of the lie. She managed a polite nod. "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Harrington." "Nonsense, call me Eleanor." The woman's gaze shifted downward, her face lighting up at the sight of Ethan. "And who is this handsome boy?" Ethan shifted shyly, hiding against Grace's leg. Eleanor crouched to his level, her eyes warm. "Well, aren't you charming? You have Alex's eyes." Grace stiffened. The words landed like a stone in her chest. She forced a polite smile, unsure how to respond. Before she could, another voice cut through the hall, deeper, firmer. Richard Harrington entered, his presence commanding without effort. His dark suit fit perfectly, his expression calm but guarded. Unlike Eleanor, there was no warmth in his eyes, only calculation. "So this is her," Richard said, not unkind but with an edge that made Grace's skin prickle. He extended a hand. "Welcome to our home, Grace." She shook it quickly, her palm clammy. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." "Richard," he corrected smoothly, though his gaze flickered briefly toward Ethan. His brows furrowed, just slightly, as though noting something that unsettled him. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned. Dinner was prepared almost immediately, and Eleanor insisted they all sit together. The dining room gleamed with silver candlesticks and fine china. Grace felt Ethan shrink beside her at the long table, his small figure swallowed by the grandeur. Conversation flowed easily from Eleanor, who seemed eager to welcome Grace into the family. She asked about Ethan's favorite foods, whether he liked stories before bed, whether Grace enjoyed cooking. Grace answered cautiously, choosing her words with care, every sentence a reminder of the dangerous charade she had stepped into. Richard spoke less, but when he did, his questions were pointed. "And where did you say you grew up, Grace?" His tone was polite, but his eyes searched hers as though probing for cracks. Grace felt heat crawl up her neck. "Minnesota, near Duluth." The lie tasted awkward, but Alex intervened smoothly, steering the conversation away. Ethan, meanwhile, drew more attention than she expected. He sat quietly, eating the bread Eleanor placed on his plate, but every so often the family remarked on his resemblance to Alex. "Look at him," Eleanor said warmly. The The same set of the jaw. Those Harrington features run strong. Grace's fork nearly slipped from her hand. She managed a tight smile, nodding, though her mind screamed with unease. Ethan looked like his father, yes, but not Alex. And yet no one else seemed to notice the distinction. Not yet. Richard's eyes lingered longer than anyone else's. When Grace glanced up, she found him watching Ethan with a measured gaze, not hostile, but questioning. She looked away quickly, her heart hammering. As dinner wound down, Eleanor excused herself to fetch dessert. Richard rose as well, murmuring about a phone call. Grace sat in silence, her nerves stretched taut. Alex reached across the table, his hand brushing hers briefly under the cover of the linen cloth. "You're doing fine," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Grace forced a shallow breath, nodding. But she knew the truth. She might have convinced Eleanor, even charmed her, but Richard was different. His eyes held suspicion, a quiet calculation that made her stomach twist. He didn't believe everything he saw, and she had the sinking feeling he was waiting for her to slip. The Harrington mansion felt even larger the next morning, its marble floors echoing with the shuffle of servants and the hum of conversations drifting down the long corridors. Grace tried to keep her composure as she guided Ethan by the hand, following Alex toward the family's sitting room. She had slept only a few hours, her mind restless, every nerve bracing for the moment she might slip and expose the truth. But nothing could have prepared her for what awaited behind the paneled doors. A voice carried through the hall before the door even opened, low, confident, with a hint of arrogance that made Grace's skin prickle. She froze mid-step, her heart skipping. The sound was unmistakable, burned into her memory from another life. When Alex pushed open the door, Grace's breath caught. Standing by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in hand, was Christopher Harrington, Alex's younger brother. He was older now, his jaw more defined, his suit impeccable, but the smirk on his lips was the same one she remembered the night he had walked away from her. Grace's knees weakened. She gripped Ethan's hand too tightly and the boy winced. Chris turned, his expression casual until his gaze landed on her. For a split second, he looked stunned, the glass lowering in his hand. Then recognition sharpened his features, followed swiftly by something darker. Fear, perhaps, or anger. "Chris!" Alex greeted, unaware of the silent battle sparking between them. "You made it back from Chicago." Chris forced a smile, setting the glass down. "Of course. I wouldn't miss meeting your fiancé." The word dripped with mockery. Grace stood paralyzed, every instinct screaming to run, but Alex gently guided her forward. "Grace, this is my brother, Christopher. Chris, this is Grace Miller." Their eyes locked. Grace's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Chris tilted his head, his smile widening in a way only she could recognize as a warning. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, oblivious. "Mommy, I'm thirsty." The sound of the word pierced the air. Chris stiffened, his gaze darting to the child. For a heartbeat, all color drained from his face. The resemblance was undeniable, the curve of Ethan's jaw, the shade of his eyes. Grace saw the realization hit him like a blow. He recovered, quickly, straightening his shoulders. "Charming," he said smoothly, his voice under tight control. "I didn't know you came with extra blessings, Alex." Alex chuckled lightly, missing the venom beneath the words. "Ethan's a good kid. You'll like him." Grace couldn't bear another second. "Excuse me," she murmured, clutching Ethan's hand as she led him toward the hallway. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She barely noticed Alex calling after her. She didn't stop until she reached a small corridor off the main hall, where portraits lined the walls and the hum of voices faded. She lowered Ethan onto a bench, handing him a toy from the duffel. "Stay here, sweetheart. Don't move." Before she could steady herself, Chris appeared, closing the distance in long, deliberate strides. He leaned against the wall, blocking her path. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" His voice was low, sharp enough to cut. Grace's throat tightened. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know Alex was your brother. Chris's eyes burned into hers. You expect me to believe this is coincidence? That you show up on my brother's arm with my— He stopped, his jaw clenched, glancing toward Ethan. Does he know? Grace shook her head, her voice breaking. No, no one knows, and you'll keep it that way. Chris stepped closer, his presence suffocating. If you tell Alex, if you breathe a word to my parents, I will ruin you. Do you understand me? You've already taken enough from me. Don't you dare take this family's trust, too. Tears stung Grace's eyes. I never asked for this. You left me. You walked away when I needed you. Don't stand there and act like I owe you silence. He leaned down, his whisper venomous. You owe me everything. Keep your mouth shut, or you'll regret it. Grace's chest heaved, rage and fear warring inside her. She wanted to scream, to tell Alex the truth, to shatter the lies Chris built his life upon. But then she looked back at Ethan, small and fragile on the bench, humming softly as he rolled his toy truck. Her resolve collapsed. She couldn't risk her son's safety. Not now. Not like this. She nodded once, her voice trembling. Fine. I'll stay quiet. But not for you, for him. Chris's eyes softened for the briefest moment, then hardened again. He straightened, adjusting his cufflinks as though nothing had happened. Good. Then we understand each other. He turned and walked back toward the sitting room, his stride confident, leaving Grace pressed against the wall, her hand shaking. She gathered Ethan into her arms, burying her face in his hair. It's going to be okay, she whispered, though she no longer believed her own words. The mansion loomed around her, its warmth suddenly suffocating, every shadow a threat. She had stepped into this world seeking refuge, but now she realized she was trapped in a web spun long before she arrived. And Chris held the threads. That night, the Harrington estate lay quiet beneath a blanket of snow, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. Grace couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the guest room bed, her hands trembling in her lap, while Ethan breathed softly beside her. The boy slept without care, his small body curled against the pillow, but Grace's heart thudded with dread. Chris's threat echoed in her ears. Keep quiet, or you'll regret it. She had carried the secret for years, and now it was standing in the very same house as its consequence. The burden was crushing her chest, suffocating with every breath. She could no longer pretend this was something she could bear alone. When a soft knock came at the door, she startled. It's me, Alex's voice whispered. She opened it hesitantly. He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him, his expression taut. You left so suddenly earlier. Are you all right? Grace shook her head, unable to hold his gaze. Her throat closed around the words she'd buried for too long. Alex stepped closer, his brow furrowed, his voice gentler this time. Grace, talk to me. If something's wrong, I need to know. Her eyes filled with tears. She turned away, pressing her palms to her face, muffling a sob. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. Can't do what? She drew a sharp breath, turned back and met his eyes. Lie to you. Pretend that everything is simple. It's not. It never was. Alex froze, his jaw tightening. What are you saying? Her knees gave way, and she sank onto the chair near the window. Her voice shook, but the words tumbled out, raw and unstoppable. Ethan, he isn't just my son. He's Chris's. The silence that followed was deafening. Alex stood motionless, as though the air had been sucked from the room. His eyes flickered toward Ethan, then back to her, disbelief written across his face. What? He said hoarsely. Grace's tears spilled freely now. Years ago, before Alex, before all this, Chris and we were together, briefly. He left me when I needed him most. He never knew Alex. He never cared enough to ask. I raised Ethan alone. Alex staggered back a step, running a hand through his hair as though trying to piece the world together again. "My brother!" The words broke off, strangled. Grace wanted to reach for him, but shame held her back. "I didn't come here to trick you. I didn't even know you were related until I saw him. I swear, I never would have agreed to this if I had known." He paced to the other side of the room, his breathing uneven. For a moment, she thought he might shout or storm out, or look at her with the same contempt Chris had. But instead, he stopped at the window, his hand braced against the cold glass, his shoulders rigid. When he turned back, his eyes were raw but steady. "Why didn't you tell me right away?" Grace's voice cracked. "Because he threatened me. Because I'm terrified. And because if your family finds out, they'll hate me. They'll see me as a liar who tried to sneak into their world." Alex studied her for a long, painful moment. Then he crossed the room and crouched in front of her, his hand closing gently around hers. "Grace, look at me." She forced her eyes up, bracing for anger. But his gaze held something else. Fury, yes, but not at her. "You did nothing wrong." "He did. Chris abandoned you, abandoned his child. That shame is his, not yours." A sob burst from her throat. "But it's your family. It's your name. This will destroy everything." Alex shook his head, his grip tightening. "No, I won't let it destroy you. Or Ethan. You hear me? Whatever storm this brings, I'll take it on. You and your son are under my protection now." Her breath hitched, disbelief mingling with fragile hope. "Why? You don't owe us anything." His eyes softened, the anger fading into something deeper. "Maybe at first this was just about repaying a debt, about helping you through a storm. But somewhere along the way it became more. You matter to me, Grace. Ethan matters to me. This isn't pretend anymore." Her heart squeezed, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. She had built walls around herself for so long, but in that moment a crack split open. Alex brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "We'll keep this between us for now, but when the truth comes, we'll face it together. I promise you that." Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as a warmth spread through her chest, a fragile spark of trust she hadn't dared to feel in years. "Thank you," she whispered. Behind them, Ethan stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly before settling again. Grace glanced at him, then back at Alex, realizing for the first time in a long time that she wasn't entirely alone. The secret was still heavy, the storm still looming, but for this moment, in this quiet room, Grace felt the faint outline of something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. The following days in the Harrington mansion unfolded like scenes from a play in which Grace could never forget her lines. Meals were long, formal affairs, held in the grand dining room beneath a chandelier that glittered with crystal light. Every time she took her seat beside Alex, with Ethan at her side, Grace felt the eyes of the family on her, measuring her worth, dissecting every word. Eleanor, gracious as ever, filled the silence with warmth. "Ethan, darling," she cooed, passing him a plate of roasted chicken. "You have your uncle's appetite. Alex used to eat twice as much at your age." She laughed lightly, brushing off crumbs from her napkin. "And those eyes, Harrington eyes, if I've ever seen them." Grace's stomach nodded, though she forced a polite smile. The words were meant as compliments, but each one felt like a knife edge, pressing closer to the truth she carried. Richard was less easily charmed. He rarely spoke during meals, but when he did, his questions cut sharp. "Grace," he said one evening, his fork poised midair, "what did you say your parents did for a living?" She hesitated, her palms damp under the tablecloth. "They ran a small business. Nothing significant." Richard's gaze lingered, weighing her response, before he finally looked away. Grace exhaled, her relief short-lived. She could feel suspicion coiling in his stare, as though he sensed there was more to uncover. Ethan, oblivious to the undercurrents, laughed at something Alex whispered to him, his small hands clutching his spoon. For a moment, The boy's joy pierced through the heaviness, and Grace clung to it desperately. It was on the third evening that the balance shifted. The heavy front doors opened with a gust of cold air, and the sound of a cane tapping against the marble floor echoed down the hall. "Father," Richard said, rising from his chair. Edward Harrington Sr. entered the room, a tall man despite his years, his silver hair combed neatly back, his eyes sharp and commanding even at his age, swept over the table before landing on Grace and Ethan. "So," he said slowly, his voice deep with authority, "this is the family I've heard so much about." Eleanor hurried forward, beaming. "Yes, father. This is Grace, Alex's fiancé. And this," she turned toward the child, "is little Ethan." The old man's stern expression softened as he looked at the boy. He crouched, surprisingly agile, and extended a hand. Ethan, after a moment's hesitation, placed his small hand in his. Edward smiled, a rare and genuine curve of his lips. Strong grip, just like a Harrington should have. He glanced up, his gaze locking briefly with Grace's before returning to Ethan. "Tell me, do you like stories, boy?" Ethan nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir." "Then tonight I'll tell you one, about when I was your uncle's age." Edward chuckled, standing tall again, his cane tapping against the floor as he moved to his seat. The atmosphere shifted. Eleanor glowed with delight at her father's approval, while Richard remained inscrutable, though a muscle in his jaw twitched. Grace exhaled quietly, grateful that, for now, the child was adored rather than questioned. But relief was fleeting. Every meal thereafter felt heavier, each glance sharper. Eleanor's kindness wrapped Grace in warmth, but Richard's cold suspicion gnawed at her nerves. And Chris, always Chris, hovered at the edge of every moment, his smirk like a shadow she couldn't escape. Late one night, after the house had grown quiet, Grace slipped into the hall to fetch water. The mansion was dark, lit only by the faint glow of sconces along the walls. She moved carefully, the silence amplifying the sound of her own footsteps. "Out of place, aren't you?" The voice came from the shadows. She startled, nearly dropping the glass in her hand. Chris stepped out of the darkness, his tie loosened, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "What do you want?" she whispered harshly, glancing down the hall to ensure no one else was near. He leaned close, his breath tinged with liquor. "To remind you that silence is your only option. One wrong word, Grace, and this whole fantasy crumbles. Alex will see you for the liar you are. My parents will despise you. And that boy of yours," his eyes flicked toward the guest wing where Ethan slept, "he'll lose everything." Again, Grace's chest constricted. "Don't talk about him." Chris smirked. "Then don't give me reason to." He straightened, adjusting his cufflinks as though nothing had passed between them, and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Grace trembling in the hallway, her glass of water untouched. She pressed her back against the wall, forcing herself to breathe. The mansion, with all its grandeur, felt more like a gilded cage by the day. Every kindness from Eleanor, every approving glance from Edward Sr., every suspicious look from Richard, it was all suffocating. And behind it all, Chris's presence lingered, a constant reminder that her secret was no longer hers alone. Dinner that evening began like all the others, polished silver, fine china, and a table set with formality that pressed against Grace's chest like a weight. Eleanor chatted warmly. Richard sat in quiet scrutiny. Edward Sr. listened with a patient gaze, and Chris smirked from across the table as if holding a secret no one else could see. Grace had endured nights of this tension. Every compliment about Ethan's resemblance, every probing glance from Richard, every cruel whisper from Chris in the shadows. Tonight, the walls felt too close, her lungs too tight. She caught Ethan's bright eyes, innocent and trusting, and knew she couldn't keep hiding. It began with Richard. He set his fork down, his gaze sharp. "Alex," he said evenly, "I've humored this charade long enough. Something doesn't add up. That boy, he doesn't just resemble you. He resembles, his eyes cut to Chris. The room stilled. Alex stiffened, Eleanor's smile faltered, and Chris leaned back in his chair, the smirk deepening. Careful, father, he drawled. You might insult our guest. Grace's pulse roared in her ears. Eleanor frowned, confused. Richard, what are you saying? Richard's hand tightened into a fist on the table. I'm saying there's a truth being hidden here, and it involves our family name. Look at him. He gestured to Ethan, who shrank in his chair, clutching his spoon. Anyone with eyes can see it. Eleanor gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Her gaze flickered between Chris, Ethan, and Grace. No, that can't be. Chris chuckled bitterly. You really think she landed in Alex's lap by coincidence? Come on. She knew exactly what she was doing. Grace's breath hitched. Stop it, she whispered. Chris's eyes gleamed with triumph. Tell them, Grace. Or should I? The words broke something inside her. For too long she had carried the shame alone, let fear guide her silence. Now Ethan sat trembling under their stares, confused and frightened, and she knew the cost of silence was too high. She pushed back her chair, rising on shaky legs. Enough. Her voice cracked, but grew stronger. You want the truth? Fine. Ethan is Chris's son. The room erupted. Eleanor's hand flew to her chest, her face crumpling with grief. Richard surged to his feet, his voice thunderous. Christopher. Edward Sr., usually so composed, looked stricken, his eyes, sharp even in age, dimmed with profound disappointment. You, he said, his voice breaking. My own grandson, who I trusted, who I thought had honor. Chris's smirk faltered, but he masked it with arrogance. It was years ago. A mistake. She was nothing. I never asked for this. Grace's eyes burned. Nothing? I was carrying your child while you walked away, while you left me to fend for myself. Don't you dare call him a mistake. Ethan whimpered softly, hiding against Grace's side. Alex pushed his chair back, his face pale with fury. He rose, stepping between Grace and Chris. That's enough. Richard's rage turned fully on Chris. You've shamed this family, lied to us all, and worse, you abandoned your own flesh and blood. Eleanor sobbed quietly, covering her face with trembling hands. How could you, Chris? How could you? Chris's mask slipped. His eyes darted, searching for escape, but Alex stood firm, his voice cold. You think you can keep running from your failures? Not this time. The truth is out, and everyone sees you for what you are, a coward. Chris sneered, but the weight of the family's stares pinned him in place. Edward Sr. struck the floor with his cane, the sharp sound cutting through the chaos. Enough! Christopher, you have disgraced us. This woman, this child, they are part of this family whether you like it or not. And you have no place at this table until you learn responsibility. Chris opened his mouth, then closed it, his face twisting. Without another word, he shoved back his chair and stormed from the room, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. Silence hung heavy in his absence. Grace stood trembling. Ethan clutched to her, expecting judgment to turn on her next. Instead, Alex's voice broke the quiet, steady and resolute. You will not blame Grace. She protected Ethan the only way she knew how. The fault lies with Chris, not her, not the boy. Richard's jaw clenched, but he did not speak. Eleanor lowered her hands, tears streaking her cheeks as she looked at Ethan with new eyes. Not suspicion, but sorrow. Edward Sr. straightened slowly, his face grave. Grace, he said, his tone heavy but not unkind. You've carried a burden alone for too long. That ends now. As long as you are under my roof, no harm will come to you or the child. That is my word. Grace's vision blurred with tears. She clutched Ethan closer, her body shaking with both relief and fear. Alex stepped to her side, his hand brushing her arm in silent reassurance. This isn't about appearances anymore, Alex said firmly, his gaze sweeping over his parents. It's about doing what's right. Grace and Ethan stay with me. The declaration left no room for argument. For the first time, Grace saw Alex not just as her rescuer, but as her shield. His loyalty was no longer an act for his grandfather's sake. It was real, fierce, and unshakable. Grace met his eyes, her breath catching at the depth she saw there. In that moment, amid the wreckage of secrets laid bare, something new took root. Fragile, uncertain, but real. She had spoken the truth at last, and though the storm had shattered the fragile peace of the Harrington home, she was no longer alone in facing its aftermath. The days following the storm of revelation were unlike anything the Harrington family had endured. Silence lingered in the mansion's halls, broken only by the echo of footsteps or the whisper of servants moving discreetly. Christopher's absence was palpable. His chair at the dining table remained empty. His voice no longer tainted the air with smugness. The man who once walked with arrogance now carried only disgrace. The decision came swiftly. Richard, usually deliberate, announced it with steel in his voice. Christopher is cut off. From the trust, from the estate, from any inheritance. Until he proves he can act with honor. He is no son of mine. Eleanor had wept, but even she did not argue. Her tears were not for the punishment, but for the shame Chris had brought upon them. Edward Sr. had sat with his cane in hand, his face etched in sorrow. He chose his path, he murmured, his voice heavy. And in doing so, he has lost more than money. He has lost the respect of his family. Grace listened, heart pounding. Ethan curled against her side. She expected to feel guilty, to feel like she had delivered the blow that destroyed a man standing in his own home. But instead, she felt something else, relief. At last, the truth was no longer her prison. For Ethan, the changes came quietly but profoundly. At the next family meal, Eleanor sat him beside her, spooning mashed potatoes onto his plate with a smile. "Eat, darling. You'll grow tall and strong like your Uncle Alex." She kissed the crown of his head as though he had always been hers to love. Richard, though slower to soften, began to include Ethan in small ways. He asked him about his toy truck, listened as the boy babbled, even offered a faint smile that startled Grace with its rarity. The greatest moment came when Edward Sr. called Ethan to him one snowy afternoon in the sitting room. The old man's eyes, sharp and wet, studied the boy before he lowered his cane and knelt slowly, his knees cracking. He opened his arms. "Come here, my great-grandson," he said, his voice trembling. Ethan hesitated, then rushed forward, colliding against the man's chest. Edward's arms wrapped around him with surprising strength. Tears glistened as they ran down the old man's face, his lips pressing to the child's hair. "At last," he whispered, "a true Harrington in my arms. Not by deception, not by appearances, but by blood." Grace stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, her vision blurred by tears. For years she had feared Ethan would be seen as a mistake, as an unwanted secret. Now, in the embrace of his grandfather, she saw acceptance, unconditional and real. Later, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Alex found her standing by the window, watching snowflakes drift through the gray afternoon sky. He approached quietly, his presence warm behind her. "You did it," he said softly. She shook her head. "No, I told the truth. It nearly destroyed everything." Alex stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers. "It destroyed Chris, not you, not Ethan. You gave us a chance to build something real." Grace turned to him, searching his eyes. "But this started as a lie, a performance. How can we pretend to move forward when so much began in deception?" His lips curved faintly, though his eyes held no amusement, only depth. Because somewhere along the way, it stopped being a performance. "I don't want to pretend anymore, Grace. Not with you." Her breath caught. For weeks, she had told herself this was temporary, a fragile bargain born of desperation. But in his gaze, she saw sincerity, an anchor she hadn't dared hope for. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying I want you to stay," Alex said firmly. "Not as an arrangement, not as a debt, but as my partner. Ethan already feels like my son, and you feel like the piece of me I didn't know I was missing." Tears stung her eyes, but this time they weren't born of fear. She let out a shaky laugh. "You don't even know what you're asking. I'm complicated, messy, broke." "Good," he replied, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "So am I, just in different ways." Her laugh broke into a sob, and when Alex pulled her into his arms, she let herself melt against him, her walls crumbling. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in something beyond survival. That night, after Ethan was tucked into bed, Grace stood by the window of the guest room, staring at the sprawling grounds dusted with snow. She thought of where she had been only weeks before, standing in the freezing streets with no home, no future, no hope. Now, the mansion that once felt like a gilded cage had become something different, a sanctuary. Chris had lost everything: his family's trust, his position, his dignity. But Grace had gained what she never thought possible: love, respect, and a place for her son to belong. The sweet revenge wasn't in watching Chris fall, it was in knowing she had risen. That Ethan would grow up not as a secret, but as a cherished part of the family that finally saw his worth. As she lay down that night, Alex's hand finding hers beneath the blanket, Grace closed her eyes with a peace she had never known. The storm had taken nearly everything from her, but it had also carried her to the one place she had always longed for: home.